The heavy rain battered against the windshield of the Ford F-150, turning the scenic route through the Appalachian Mountains into a blurred nightmare. Alan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Beside him, his wife Sharon was frantically trying to get a signal on her iPhone. "No bars," Sharon sighed, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. "I told you we should have stuck to the interstate, Alan." "The GPS said this was a shortcut to Vermont," Alan muttered, squinting through the downpour. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the truck, followed by the sickening sound of a tire shredding. The vehicle swerved into the muddy shoulder and came to a halt. Alan cursed under his breath. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. The front tire was completely blown. Worse, they were miles from civilization, surrounded by dense, dark woods. "There's a light up ahead," Sharon called out from the window, pointing towards a faint, flickering glow through the trees. Leaving the truck, they trudged through the mud towards the light. It led them to a dilapidated farmhouse that looked like it had been standing since the Civil War. The porch creaked ominously as they stepped up and knocked. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look right through them. She wore a faded floral dress that looked decades out of style. "Car trouble?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yes, ma'am," Alan said, shivering. "Our truck broke down. May we use your phone?" "Lines are down due to the storm," she said, opening the door wider. "But you can wait it out. I have hot stew." Grateful but uneasy, they entered. The living room was filled with antique furniture and smelled of damp wood and dried herbs. In the corner, a young man sat in a rocking chair, staring blankly at the fireplace. He was huge, wearing dirty overalls, and didn't acknowledge them. "That's my grandson, Caleb," the old woman said, noticing their stares. "He doesn't talk much. Not since the accident." She served them bowls of stew. It tasted strange, metallic and earthy, but they were too hungry to complain. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Sharon noticed that all the calendars on the wall were from 1994. "I need to use the restroom," Alan said, excusing himself. Walking down the dim hallway, Alan noticed a door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and he peeked inside. The room was covered in dust, but on the bed lay a suit and a wedding dress, perfectly preserved. On the nightstand, he saw a newspaper clipping. The headline froze his blood. "Local farmhouse destroyed in fire. Grandmother and grandson perish. October 12, 1994. Alan's heart pounded against his ribs. He rushed back to the living room to grab Sharon. "We need to leave. Now," Alan whispered, grabbing her arm. "Why? What's wrong?" Sharon asked, confused. "Just trust me." As they moved towards the door, the old woman blocked their path. Her sweet demeanor had vanished. Her face was now twisted in a sorrowful rage. Caleb stood up, his massive frame blocking the firelight, casting a long, demonic shadow. "Leaving so soon?" the old woman hissed. "But the fire hasn't started yet." Suddenly, the smell of damp wood was replaced by the overwhelming stench of smoke and burning flesh. The walls seemed to glow with heat. "Run!" Alan screamed. They burst out of the door into the storm, not looking back. Behind them, they heard the roaring sound of a massive inferno. But when they turned around from the road, there was no fire, only the dark, silent ruin of a house that looked like it had burned down years ago. Terrified, they ran until they found a highway patrol car at dawn. "You folks look like you've seen a ghost," the officer said, as they sat in the back of his cruiser, wrapped in blankets. "The farmhouse," Alan stammered. "The old woman and Caleb." The officer's face went pale. "You took the old Hollow Creek Road. Folks around here don't go there. That house burned down 30 years ago tonight. No one survived." Alan and Sharon held each other's hands, the cold rain still clinging to their skin, knowing they had spent the night in a grave. The rain battered against the window pane of the cluttered apartment in New Orleans. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. I sat across from Theodore Thorne, a man whose reputation as an occultist was whispered only in the darkest corners of the city. To me, he was just an eccentric mentor with a library full of forbidden books. "You look distracted, David," Thorne said, his voice raspy. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, sliding one across the scratched wooden table. "It's those birds," I muttered, gesturing to the window. Perched on the fire escape, unbothered by the storm, sat 3 large black crows. They were staring right at us. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He took a slow sip of his drink and leaned back. 3 crows. Ancient folklore says 3 crows signify a wedding. But in my line of work, David, 3 crows often mean something far more sinister. They are the Watchers. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling around his gray beard. "It reminds me of a case I handled back in the 70s, up in a small, forgotten town in the Appalachians called Blackwood Creek." Thorne began his tale. "I was drifting back then, looking for old folk magic. I stayed at a boarding house run by a nervous man named Harry. Harry was a good man, but he was terrified. He told me he was being followed, not by a man, but by birds. Every morning for a week, he'd find 3 crows waiting on his porch. He threw stones at them, shouted at them, but they wouldn't leave. They just watched him with those bead-like, intelligent eyes. The locals whispered that Harry had upset something in the woods, an old spirit or a witch who didn't take kindly to trespassers." Thorne paused to relight his pipe. The storm outside seemed to grow louder. One evening, Harry came to my room, shaking. He said, "Theodore, they are inside." I grabbed my flashlight and followed him to the attic. It was cold, unnaturally so. And there, sitting on the rafters, were the 3 crows. They shouldn't have been able to get in. The windows were nailed shut. I tried to banish them using an old ritual I'd picked up in the bayous, but the moment I started chanting, the birds didn't fly away. Instead, they dissolved. They turned into thick, black smoke that swirled together, forming the shape of a woman. She wasn't solid, just a shadow with burning red eyes. Harry screamed. The shadow lunged at him, passing right through his chest. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The attic was empty. No birds, no shadow. Just the sound of Harry gasping for air. "Did he die?" I asked, gripping my glass. "Not then," Thorne replied grimly. But the next morning, Harry was found dead in his bed. Heart failure, the doctor said. But when they moved his body, they found something under his pillow. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. 3 black feathers. A sudden clap of thunder made me jump. I looked back at the window. The fire escape was empty. The crows were gone. Thorne smiled a dry, humorless smile. "They are just messengers, David. The question is, who are they delivering the message to this time? You or me?" I found the journal on a Greyhound bus heading to New Orleans. It was a tattered, coffee-stained notebook tucked between the seats. No name, no address, just the scribbles of a man who called himself Uncle Monty. Uncle Monty wasn't your average guy. While folks in the South hunted deer or catfish, Monty hunted ghosts. But he didn't use proton packs or EMF readers. He used acting. Here is the wildest entry from his log. October 31st, Blackwood Manor. I finally broke into the old Blackwood place on the edge of the bayou. The locals say it's cursed. I say it's an opportunity. The floorboards groaned under my boots like dying cats. Dust hung in the air thick enough to chew on. I climbed to the second floor, avoiding the rotten steps, hoping to find a spirit. I didn't have to wait long. "Hey, you! What do you think you're doing?" I looked up. Floating a few inches off the ground was a shimmering, translucent old man wearing a beat-up fedora and chomping on a phantom cigar. He looked like a crooked car salesman from the 1950s. "I said beat it, pal!" the ghost barked. "This is prime real estate, and I ain't sharing." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I remembered my plan. I didn't run. Instead, I slumped my shoulders, let my jaw hang loose, and gave him a dead-eyed stare. "Relax, buddy," I croaked, trying to sound hollow. "I just checked out. Fresh meat, or fresh spirit, I guess." The ghost squinted at me, floating closer. "You kicked the bucket? Recently?" "Yeah," I lied. "Bad clam chowder. Took me out instantly. Just looking for a place to haunt." The old ghost's face softened. "Ah, tough break, kid. Name's Barnaby. Used to sell swampland to tourists before, well, you know." "Nice to meet you, Barnaby. I'm Monty." "Well, Monty," Barnaby said, putting a spectral arm around me which felt like walking into a freezer. "Stick with me. I'll teach you the ropes. Humans are a pain in the neck, see? Always coming in with their cameras and renovations. You gotta scare 'em off." For the next hour, Barnaby taught me everything. "Rule number 1, he explained, the cold spot. You gotta hover right behind their neck. Makes the hair stand up. Works every time. Rule number 2, he chuckled, rattle the pipes. They think it's plumbing, but it drives them nuts." I was mentally taking notes for my book. This was gold. A real ghost teaching me the trade secrets of the afterlife. Barnaby thought I was one of them, a rookie spook who needed a mentor. But the dusty air of the Blackwood Manor was getting to me. I felt a tickle in my nose. I tried to hold it back. I pinched my nose. I held my breath. Barnaby was in the middle of a story about scaring a pizza delivery guy when it happened. "Ah! Choo!" The sneeze was loud. It echoed through the empty halls like a gunshot. Barnaby froze. The cigar fell from his mouth and vanished before hitting the floor. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Did you just sneeze?" Barnaby whispered, shrinking back. Dust allergy?" I said sheepishly, wiping my nose. "Ghosts don't have allergies!" Barnaby shrieked, his voice vibrating with panic. "Ghosts don't breathe! You're a breather! You're alive!" "Wait, Barnaby, I can explain." "Get away from me!" the ghost screamed, flying backward through a wall. "A live one! Help! He's got germs! He's gonna sue me! He's gonna remodel!" In seconds, the room was empty. Barnaby had fled in sheer terror. It turns out ghosts are more scared of the living than we are of them, especially the living who sneeze. It's been 2 years, I think. Or maybe 3. Time feels slippery here, like oil on water. I honestly don't remember how I ended up on this porch, watching the sun dip below the pines. I used to have a life back in Ohio, a job at a diner, a beat-up truck, bills to pay. But that feels like a dream now. I was hitchhiking through upstate New York when I met Old Man Miller. He picked me up in his dusty Ford near the state line. I told him I was looking for work, something quiet. "I got a place," Miller had said, his eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. Big old estate up on Blackwood Hill. It's been in the family for generations, but my kids in the city don't want nothing to do with it. Too spooky for 'em. I need a caretaker. You stay for free, eat whatever's in the pantry. Just keep the weeds down and the windows shut. It sounded too good to be true. A roof over my head and food in my belly for doing practically nothing. I said yes before the truck even stopped rolling. The house was a Victorian monstrosity, peeling white paint and towering turrets, swallowed by the dense forest. Miller showed me around. Huge, dusty rooms, furniture covered in sheets like ghosts, and a kitchen stocked with enough canned goods to last a winter. He left the next morning, handing me a set of heavy iron keys. "Don't listen to the wind, son," he said with a wink, "and stay out of the attic." The first few days were peaceful. I cleared some brush, fixed a few shingles, but then I started seeing her. It was dusk when I first saw the woman. She was out by the old vegetable garden, kneeling in the dirt, picking wild tomatoes. She wore a faded yellow sundress, the kind from the 50s. I called out, "Hey, can I help you?" She didn't turn. I walked closer, blinking against the dying light. When I was 10 feet away, I looked down to step over a root, and when I looked up, she was gone. Just gone. The air smelled thick and sweet, like rotting magnolias. I told myself it was the isolation playing tricks on me. But that night, the house woke up. I was lying on the cot in the parlor when I heard it. Music. A slow, scratchy jazz record playing from the floor above. Then came the laughter. Not one person, but a crowd. Glasses clinking, high heels clicking on hardwood. It sounded like a great Gatsby party was raging in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and ran up the stairs. The hallway was cold, dead silent. The attic door was padlocked just as Miller had left it. I put my ear to the wood. Nothing but the settling groans of the old house. "Crazy," I muttered. "I'm going crazy." But the next week, things got weirder. I went into town to the general store to buy tobacco. The clerk, a grizzled guy named Frank, went pale when I told him where I was staying. "Blackwood Hill?" Frank whispered. "Son, you best pack your bags. Folks who stay there, they change. They get comfortable. Too comfortable. Last fella who stayed there stopped coming to town. Found him a year later, skinny as a rail, sitting on the porch, smiling at nothing. Died 2 days later." "I ain't afraid of ghosts," I said, puffing my chest out. "It ain't the ghosts you gotta fear," Frank said darkly. "It's the house. It likes company." I laughed it off. But that night, the dream came. I woke up paralyzed. Standing around my cot were a dozen men. They were all dressed in identical black suits, like undertakers. The terrifying part wasn't their clothes. It was their faces. They all had the exact same face. My face, but twisted, smiling a wide, manic smile. They started to dance, a silent, jerky shuffle round and round my bed, their shoes making no sound. They pointed at me and mouthed words I couldn't hear. Then, the sweet smell of magnolias filled the room, choking me, lulling me back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining. The birds were singing, and I felt great. Why was I ever worried? Why did I want to leave? This place is paradise. There are wild berries in the woods, the roof doesn't leak anymore, and the nights are never lonely with the music upstairs. Frank at the store doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't need money. I don't need the world out there. Old man Miller hasn't sent a check in months, but I don't care. I sold some of the antique silverware to a passerby yesterday for cash. It's fine. It's all fine. I'm the master of Blackwood Hill now. I sit on the porch, watching the woman in the yellow dress pick tomatoes. She waved at me today. I think I'll stay here forever. After all, why would anyone ever want to leave home? The fog in Montana is different. It doesn't just obscure your vision, it feels like it wants to swallow you whole. I had driven 6 hours through the winding roads of the Rockies to reach Dead Man's Creek, a desolate railway outpost that didn't even appear on most GPS maps. My Uncle Ben was the station master there. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he took this job to get away from the city noise. He said he found peace here. When I pulled up to the station, it looked like a relic from the 1950s. Weather-beaten wood, peeling paint, and a silence so heavy it pressed against my eardrums. The only sound was the wind howling through the pines. Uncle Ben was waiting on the platform. He looked older, his face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He wore his old railway uniform, which looked strangely crisp despite the dusty surroundings. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere, Mike," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't hug me, he just gripped my shoulder with a hand that felt ice cold. That night, over a dinner of canned beans and lukewarm coffee in his office, Ben gave me a strange warning. "Listen to me carefully, Mike. Things out here, they aren't always what they seem. The isolation plays tricks on the mind. If you see people walking the tracks or hear trains that aren't on the schedule, just ignore them. Do not engage." I laughed it off. "Ghosts, Uncle Ben?" He didn't smile. "Echoes. Just echoes." Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered out onto the platform. The fog was thick, swirling under the pale yellow station lights. That's when I saw her. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, sitting on a bench at the far end of the platform. She wore a floral dress that looked like it belonged in a vintage shop. I walked over. "Hey, waiting for the midnight freight." She looked up, startled. Her eyes were impossibly sad. "I'm waiting for my father," she whispered. "He's the engineer on the Silver Streak. He's late." "The Silver Streak?" I frowned. "I don't think that line runs anymore." "It does tonight," she said, pointing into the darkness. Suddenly, the rails began to vibrate. A low whistle pierced the silence. Not the horn of a modern diesel engine, but the mournful wail of an old steam locomotive. A massive train emerged from the fog, black iron and billowing smoke, moving completely silently. There was no clatter of wheels, no hiss of steam, just a visual specter gliding over the tracks. I stumbled back, terrified. The girl stood up, smiling, and walked towards the moving train. "Wait! No!" I shouted, reaching for her, but my hand passed right through her shoulder as if she were made of mist. She stepped onto the phantom train and vanished. The train dissolved into the fog seconds later. Heart pounding, I ran back to the office to find Ben. "Ben, I saw a girl and a train, a ghost train." Ben was sitting in his chair, staring at the wall. He didn't look at me. "I told you, Mike," he said softly. "Echoes." "Who was she?" I demanded. "That was Sarah," Ben said, his voice sounding distant, hollow. "She died in 1963, jumped in front of a train trying to stop it, trying to save her father who had suffered a heart attack at the controls." I froze. "How do you know that?" Ben slowly turned his head. The light in the room seemed to flicker and dim. Half of his face looked wrong, decayed. "Because I was the conductor on that train, Mike," he whispered. "We all died that night. The bridge over the creek had collapsed." I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. No. Ben, I spoke to you on the phone yesterday. Did you? Ben smiled, a sad, gruesome smile. Or did you just want to believe someone was still here? I turned and ran. I scrambled into my car, tires screeching as I tore out of the parking lot, not daring to look back until I was miles away on the main highway. The next morning, I stopped at a diner in the nearest town and asked the waitress about the station at Dead Man's Creek. She poured coffee into my cup and gave me a puzzled look. Dead Man's Creek? Honey, that station burned down 40 years ago. Nobody's been up there since the big crash in '63. It's just ruins now. I looked at the coffee in my hand, trembling. I realized then that the cold grip on my shoulder wasn't from a lonely old man. It was the touch of the grave. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windshield of my old pickup truck. I squinted through the wipers, barely making out the faded sign that read, Blackwood Manor, 2 miles. I glanced at the passenger seat. Ready for this, Buster? I asked. My 90-pound pit bull let out a low whine and rested his blocky head on his paws. He didn't like storms, and frankly, neither did I. But for $5,000 a month to watch an empty house, I'd weather a hurricane. I pulled into the last gas station before the turnoff. The old attendant, a guy with a face like crumpled leather, pumped the gas while eyeing my truck. Heading up to the manor? He asked, his voice raspy. Yeah, I said, stepping out to stretch. New caretaker. The old man stopped pumping. He looked me dead in the eye. You're the 5th one this summer, son? I chuckled nervously. High turnover rate, huh? You could say that, he muttered, screwing the cap back on. Every Saturday, usually around this time, someone goes up there. Just like you. They never come back down. Folks say the place eats them. Well, I need the money, I said, trying to sound confident. And I've got Buster here. Suit yourself, he spat on the ground. But if I were you, I'd turn this rig around. There's a reason that house sits next to the old Pioneer Cemetery. The dead don't like neighbors. I brushed off his warning as local superstition and drove on. The road to Blackwood Manor was a winding mud track through dense pine forests. By the time I reached the iron gates, it was pitch black. The manor was a rotting Victorian beast, looming against the lightning-streaked sky. Windows were boarded up, paint was peeling, yet oddly, a warm yellow light glowed from a window on the ground floor. Hello? I called out, pushing the heavy oak front door open. Mr. Blackwood? The house smelled of mildew and something else, something copper-like and sweet. The furniture was draped in white sheets, looking like ghosts in the flickering light of the single chandelier. A figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. He was tall, wearing a tuxedo that looked 50 years out of style. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he moved with a stiff, jerky gait. You must be the new man, the figure said. His voice sounded wet, like gargling water. Yes, sir, I'm Mike. This is Buster, I said, gripping the dog's leash. Buster was growling low in his throat, his hackles raised. Excellent, the man smiled. It was a ghastly smile, too wide, showing too many teeth. I am the master of this house. You may start tonight, but first, come closer. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. Something was wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run. The man took a step forward, and the light hit his neck. There was a jagged, dark gash right across his throat, oozing something black. Come here, he hissed, lunging at me with unnatural speed. Buster, get him, I yelled. The dog didn't hesitate. He launched himself at the man, clamping his powerful jaws onto the attacker's arm, but instead of a scream, the man let out a dry, hollow sound. Buster shook his head violently, and with a sickening tear, the man collapsed backward. Buster didn't stop. He went for the throat, the same throat that already looked slashed. I scrambled back, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick, ready to fight, but the body on the floor stopped moving. An hour later, the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruiser cut through the dark. Sheriff Miller looked down at the gruesome scene, then at me. "You're lucky, son. Damn lucky." "Who was he?" I asked, still shaking. "Mr. Blackwood?" The sheriff shook his head, shining his flashlight on the corpse's face. "No. This here is Old Man Jenkins. Died of pneumonia 2 months back. We buried him in the cemetery down the road." "Buried?" I stammered. "Then how?" "Grave robbers," the sheriff spat. "Or something worse. We've had reports of bodies going missing. Looks like something dragged poor Jenkins up here and used him." He looked at the empty, dark house. "Get in your truck, son. Leave town. There ain't no job worth this." I didn't argue. I loaded Buster into the truck and drove away, never looking back at the Blackwood Manor.